Hello and welcome to Chapter 9, Part 1, Sustaining Biodiversity. And this is what I consider the heart of the biodiversity unit because previous lectures were more on ecosystems and straight out biology topics. This one is really on how humans are interacting with the biodiversity on our planet. So it's not a very happy lecture, but I've tried to make it a very pretty one. And as part of that, I have on this first slide put just up a bunch of pictures of really cool looking species, from the New Zealand kiwi right here to the sawfish, which is really quite amazing. And, planet Earth really has the most amazing just spread of creatures out there. So back to, the geology topic and mass extinctions. And so there's something called the background rate of extinction, which is, species are always going to go extinct. It doesn't take an asteroid to drive species extinct. It doesn't take humans either. So there's always going to be a background rate of extinction that goes on because conditions change or the species evolve into a pathway that just is not conducive to continuing. But then there's mass extinctions. And I've mentioned this before, but we've had 5 mass extinctions since there's been prolific life on Earth, meaning multicellular complex life. Our fossil record starts about 560 million years ago, and we've recorded 5 mass extinctions. The causes for all of them are uncertain. The only one we're pretty sure about is the most recent one at 65 million years ago with the asteroid impact. But the largest one was actually called the Grand Dying. It was the Permian extinction. And as you can see it here on this graph right here. And, just a huge percentage of all life on the planet went extinct at that time. So paleontologists have known for hundreds of years that there have been these events that seem to wipe out a whole lot of life on the planet. And then what happens afterwards, we have these adaptive radiations and life comes back, but it's different than it was before. One of the most famous creatures is the trilobite that went extinct during that Permian extinction event, and you'll find fossils for them literally all over the planet. You can find them in many states here in the United States. I found them in New York State, and I know they're also found out here as well. So are humans causing a mass extinction? Are we in the middle of a 6th mass extinction? And this is really partly a philosophical question and partly a scientific one. So the question is, at what point or what kind of rate of species extinctions does there have to be to call it a mass extinction? And what is the rate? How fast are species going extinct right now? There's a lot of scientists working on this, but no one really has great answers for just how many. It's hard to get, we don't even know all these species that exist on the planet versus knowing just what percentage of those species we're driving extinct. But we know it's high. We know it's much higher than we've seen in any of our recent history. So there are many scientists arguing that they think it is a mass extinction caused by humans. So we'll be seeing some videos in class and you'll be reading an article about this too. So there's a few definitions you need. There's endangered species, which is meaning that there's so few individuals left that they are in extreme danger of going extinct. And there's a lesser category that's called threatened species, which means that the numbers are still relatively abundant, but they're declining. So the species might move from threatened to endangered if their numbers keep going down. We like to try to catch species in the threatened stage and see if we can recover them then when it's much easier. It's much easier to bring a species back from the brink of extinction when they're in the critically endangered category. There are many lists, and the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, I think that's what it stands for. There's a lot of organizations out there trying to quantify just how many species are threatened, how many species are going extinct, how many are endangered, et cetera. And then they put them into classes of species. So you can kind of take a look at this, and this is just over the last, decade and a half. Again, these sorts of charts, they are hard to really quantify to know exactly how much. So the red list are the list of species that are, the red would be critically endangered. So this organization is in the business of trying to measure just which species should we be most worried about. And when you can look at different categories of species, a lot of people have been talking about frogs, but you can also see, and lately in the news this year, there's been a lot of word about birds numbers really declining out there. So just a few more ways to look at these endangered species. And throughout this lecture, I'm going to be showing you critically endangered species where there's so few left we can count them. So the Malayan tiger, like not so many. And this data goes back maybe 3 or 4 years now. And I got all this from the World Wildlife Fund, the WWF. So or foundation. So, you know, so just these are all critically endangered species that we would be nice if we did not lose them. So again, trying to classify species is difficult, but we do know that many more species are endangered now that have been in the past. And there's a variety of reasons for that we'll be looking at throughout this lecture. This slide. So this is one, there was this article. So I went to the website and again from the WWF and I just pulled up and look at all these gorgeous animals. Rhinos, just a lot of different species of rhinos are critically endangered. If you think about it, a lot of these are top predators, and we'll talk about why our top predators or large animals in general tend to be extinction prone. And we'll look at that, and that will be more in lecture part 2, but look at all these gorgeous animals and just look at how few for some of them are actually left. And this is really sad. So the white rhino, the northern white rhino, is essentially extinct, meaning that they have the last male died. He was the last male of a species. So he died in 2018. So there are 2 female rhinos that are being protected. And it's not completely over yet because they have some like frozen sperm, et cetera. And there might be an attempt in the future to bring the species back. But if you don't have any male left of the species, that basically means you're going to go extinct. So there's this term, and it's called ecosystem services, and it was something that came out with the most recent redo of the APES curriculum. And these are all reasons, and in some ways I bristle a little bit because these are all reasons why we should care personally as humans to protect our species. And there are 4 what they call ecosystem services. So one is supporting services necessary for all the other ecosystem services. There's provisioning, so services, species that provide goods. There's regulating, benefits from the moderating of natural phenomena, and cultural, which would be then non-material benefits, but just, you know, species that we want to have around for various reasons. So these are really kind of hard to tell the difference between. So we're going to take a slide and we'll do a little bit more practice in class with these 2. How do you tell the difference, or which one of the ecosystem services these fall into? Let's roll through some of these. So categories each of the following ecosystem services as supporting, regulating, provisioning, or cultural. Photosynthesis, that's supporting because you need photosynthesis for basically all other life on the planet. Medicines would be provisioning because it provides us with some goods. Pollination would be regulating. It's going to modify what's out there. Recreation would be cultural, if we just like to say go on safari, etc. Aesthetics would be cultural again. Food, provisioning, providing us with something. Soil formation would be supporting, and again, soils are kind of the, you know, always going to give the plug for soils. They're more important than you would think. So without good soils, you can't have any of the plants doing the photosynthesis, etc. Raw materials such as wood, again, provisioning. Cleaning water and air, regulating our systems. Biodiversity, supporting, you need it for everything. And flood control would be regulating. So again, these will do some more practice with these in class, but for right now, you might need to pause this video to fill this in because there'll probably be a question on it coming up. This is a cool, pretty little diagram showing, so there's some more examples in there of the 4 different ecosystem services in a much more pretty format than the table we had on the last slide. This one kind of freaks me out. This are the horseshoe crab. And we actually use, they have this blue blood, and we use a component of that blood is used to screen all injectable medicines for bacteria. I kind of feel like there has to be a better way. This looks like torture to me. They remove some of the blood and then they actually re-release the horseshoe crabs into the wild. So it doesn't kill them, but it obviously would stress them out. And ethically, I have a hard time with this. However, just think about all of our vaccines. Think as we look to develop a coronavirus vaccine, and think about how important the horseshoe crab is for us then. So here's just a few examples of what species, things you may not have thought about. So could Tasmanian devils provide us with a new antibiotic? And so they find that marsupials, like they often live in really dirty environments. And because of that, they have like really great immune systems, like they can fight MRSA, et cetera. So scientists are looking at ways to, make new treatments that mimic those peptides. And then, why should we care about bats? Okay, they eat insects. That can damage crops, that can pass diseases along to us, et cetera. Some of them pollinate crops, et cetera. And they're actually fairly endangered bats. And so a lot of people don't like them, but we are in Halloween season right now, and actually bats do a lot for us. Bioremediation, what is that? That is when we use biology to try to solve a problem. And so what's one of the fears is if we drive species extinct, we may not know what medicinal properties they might have had or might have been able to provide us with. So using bacteria to break down plastics, to break down all kinds of petrochemicals would be one example. There's two different kinds of bioremediation. I'm going to kind of read the slide because this is DeBrew's slide, being the biologist. There's phytoremediation, where you use a plant, maybe phyto, I don't know, like photosynthesis. So for example, cilantro can be used to absorb lead and other heavy metals from water and soil. And then there's mycoremediation, which is using a fungus. All right, so not a big fan of fungus. Personally, don't like mushrooms, but fungus actually do a lot for us also with decomposing and whatnot. So I guess they've used them for helping to clean up oil spills. All right, so there's this famous phrase called HIPCO, and it stands for, we're gonna go roll through these one by one. But you should get these all written down. Number one reason for extinction and depletion of species is habitat loss. So H is for habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. I've already talked about this one, invasive species or non-native species. P for population and resource growth. And really, I kind of put a lot of our problems down to this one right there. But as far as like direct population growth encroachment, it's number 3 on the HIPCO list. Number 4, the other P is for pollution. C is for climate change, and O is for overexploitation, such as poaching, overfishing, etc. So we're going to roll through these one by one. We'll spend more time on some than others because some we spend like whole units on. Okay, so 1, habitat loss and fragmentation. You can imagine habitat loss, but fragmentation you also have to really think about. And in lecture part 2, we'll look at some ways to get around some of these problems. But if you look at the range of some of these large animals that I said are now very extinction prone, they used to like roam all over Asia, Africa, North America, when you think about the bison. And now their range has been greatly reduced by humans encroaching. And what happens is if you fragment their habitat, like look at the black rhino, if you only have a few little reserves that they can live in, imagine if a fire wipes out this area. There is no way for those rhino now to migrate to a safer area. The other thing that can happen with the fragmentation is loss of genetic diversity within the small population left in these fragmented areas. So just the pale purple is the former range, the darker one is the current range, and this is just really sad. This just shows also for trees, forest cover change from gain versus loss. And you can see the pinks are way more prevalent than the blues for gain, but we've actually lost a lot of our forested area too, again, through, not just logging, but also just human encroachment. So, I talked about this one already, the reduction of genetic diversity. This picture over on the right is kind of scary. They look at the reasons why losing the genetic diversity can make you go into an extinction vortex, which is kind of a scary term. But if you're going to preserve an area, you want to make sure that there's adequate population size so that you can have some kind of genetic diversity, because not having it means you're going to be prone to various things that might take you out, diseases, etc. And again, proves OSIP members will be able to survive any kind of ecological changes, any kind of disturbances, et cetera. The more diverse your population, the more capable they will be of surviving. Just this picture down in the bottom, you can kind of see that on a very micro level. This is, I forget if this might be California, but look at all the housing developments in all the valleys. So if you are an animal, this is one way that habitats can be fragmented. Another way is big interstate highways like I-90 can split a habitat right in two, even if it's all wild areas, mountains. As you cross Snoqualmie Pass, just I-90 can actually really prevent that wildlife from being able to move around. Okay, so habitat loss and migratory birds. Why are birds in such trouble? If the birds migrate, they need an awful lot of area. When you think about why birds are particularly hard to save, if you think about some of these North American like flyways, these birds go like all the way from Alaska down to South America, which means if you want to protect him, it's not just say the US passing a law saying we want to protect this bird. We got to talk to all the other countries, got to make sure the Canadians and the Mexicans and not all the countries in South America are on board with that. You have to make sure there's habitat being protected in each of those countries. So, and in a lot of these areas, birds use wetlands as their resting place or nesting places. And wetlands are one of the fastest disappearing biomes out there because we like to use wetlands for cropland and for building towns, etc. So it really requires a huge effort to protect these, to protect migratory birds. All right, so again, we've talked about invasive species already, but just remember it can be deliberate or accidental. We'll go through a couple more examples in this lecture. So why are they like so hard? Is that they often have no natural predators, no natural competitors, and they don't have the same parasites that might keep the native populations under control. So examples, the zebra mussels they've gotten into the Great Lakes and they've caused a huge amount of damage. The kudzu in southeastern US, that was a deliberate introduction and now it's like everywhere. So this is just, again, once a species is introduced, it is really difficult to turn back the clock and eradicate it. So again, think about the murder hornets I talked about last time. The more time that's taken before control measures kick in, the less likely you are to succeed. So if you look at this little graph down here, the detection, we detected those murder hornets just this last year. Eradication right now is feasible. We're worried that if we don't get them this year, we're going to get to this part of the curve where eradication is unlikely. And at that point, you can only try to manage it, not eradicate it. So again, the murder hornets kind of give like a real like scary example right now, but just to realize, and this little graphic up here just kind of shows you all the reasons why invasive species often have the edge over the native species. Few more examples, the Asian carp in the Mississippi River, they're really worried. They're like trying to keep it from getting too far upriver, but these things have taken over. And what they do is you can look at how prolific they are. They're going to edge out your native fish species. The economic benefits, look at just the invasive species in the Great Lakes. And so this is all the dollars lost from those. And then I've already talked about invasive species in the Pacific Northwest. So just realize number 2 reason for species going extinct. Oh, and I haven't talked about this. One of the things that you may not be aware of is that when ships cross the ocean, look at this ship right there, see all those containers? That thing would be super top heavy and would just roll over if you didn't put water in the ballast tanks below. So what they do is they load these ships up with water so that they're not top heavy and they won't roll over when they're out in the ocean. So what they do when they're in a port and they're going to go take off to cross the ocean, they will fill their tanks with ballast, with water from whatever bay you're in. So say it's a bay in China, maybe not the next best picture because it's off my map here. And then those goods come from China into Seattle. Once they get to Seattle, they offload all those containers and they often dump their ballast water right into Elliott Bay. There might be all kinds of species from China now that have just entered Elliott Bay and can get a foothold. So this is shipping routes, like really kind of amazing when you think about I mean, I live in West Seattle. I see the ships come in just about every day when I'm commuting to work. And it's amazing to think that any one of those can bring these invasive species, both marine species, and we think the murder hornet somehow hitched a ride over from something from Asia also. So this again just looks at the invasive marine species pathways and origins, and like we really are a global economy now, which also means we're globally mixing our species, often accidentally. Okay, moving along. This is the famous cane toad. I think I mentioned it in the last lecture, but it was introduced into Australia on purpose to control the beetle population that was devastating their sugarcane crops. So they thought, oh, the toads will eat the beetles, bioremediation, and did not actually work that way. So they actually got out of control and they're poisonous. And it turns out that the cats were catching the cane toads and then the cats were dying because the cane toads are poisonous for cats to eat. And it's just, they were a way bigger nuisance. So it was like good intentions, bad outcome, or unintended consequences. So, you know, we do this on purpose. It's not always accidental. All right, number 3, we're going to spend our whole next unit looking at population growth. But just realize this is just estimate. This is 2015 population density in people per square kilometer. So I always think the United States is really quite amazing that you can pretty much draw a line right down the middle of it population wise. But it's going to be also one of those reasons why we still have a lot of our species out west that we don't in the east. So looking a little bit closer at the United States, early on, we drove a lot of the species in the eastern half of the United States extinct. So you don't see wolves roaming around New York State anymore. We have a chance still to save a lot of our species out west because we're still largely empty out here. So when you look at a lot of the maps of where the endangered species are, a lot of them are in western states because we were too late to save before we really started thinking about it. We drove a lot of species in the eastern half of the United States extinct. Number 4, pollution. So we saw the problem with plastic. So there's just a visual on that one. But pollution across all kinds of factors. And we're going to be doing a unit on toxicology where we'll be taking a look more at pollution too. So I'm not going to focus on it here. Just bee colony collapse syndrome. That I think you're going to be reading that case study in your book. That's still up for debate, but they think it might be a combination of things. Pesticides, which might have already been weakening them, and then a parasite. So this has been pretty serious. And again, like another fear, if the murder hornets take off, the bees will have one more reason to have it be hard to survive. I keep going on the murder hornets. Okay, climate change. We'll be doing a lot with climate change. So again, I'm not going to go into it here, but we're going to be spending quite a lot of time on climate change a little bit later this school year. So climate change, just think about all those habitats changing, especially when you think climate change and biodiversity. Think about your specialists. Remember, they have a harder time surviving when conditions change. So your specialists are going to have a harder time if our climate change starts changing more rapidly than it has in the past. And then overexploitation. We talked about tragedy of the commons with like overfishing, et cetera, but just there's a lot of different examples out there, but just realize that the scale of the fishing that goes on now, just look at the harvest down here in the ship. We have really good technology to catch a lot of fish. And the problem is that we're depleting our fish stocks. And sometimes if it's something lower in the food chain, it might be hard for then the things higher up in the food chain like orca, et cetera, to survive. So just looking at whales, we hunted them nearly to extinction. And this is actually one of the happy stories in that we've stopped hunting. Most countries have stopped hunting whales. And so some of them are starting to come back. Our Puget Sound orcas are still very much in trouble, but that has to do with other factors like pollution and not a big enough food supply. Then it does. We don't really hunt those whales anymore. So if you look at the depletion of the whales on the right side, though, we got to the point where it was really critical for a lot of them. The good news is some of them are starting to come back. And then sharks. Sharks are another one, and there's some organizations. These are all infographics from like Save the Whale, Save the Sharks types of places. But just looking at again at how many sharks we've lost and how much they've been hunted. And we fear sharks, but realize that really the sharks should be fearing us because we do a lot more harm to them than they ever do to humans. Okay, and then finally, the elephants. We also, and again, large animals, all of these are large animals that just, we've taken them for their tusks, has been one of the most primary reasons why elephants have become hunted to like really reduce their numbers. And so there's a lot of laws in place and things in place to try to reduce this, but it is hard because, it's a big nation and elephants are in a lot of places. And if you're going to be a poacher, it can be very hard to protect those elephants. And that is the end of this lecture, part 1, and we'll see you back for lecture part 2.